And the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all.
Hello and welcome to the only independent news and opinion program where we chronicle two distinct possibilities, either the demise and possible extinction of the Homo sapien or the greatest leap forward in all of human history. One thing is certain, there is no status quo. This is the Daily Australian Radio Show, episode number 55 or 50 plus GST, depending on where you are in the world, Friday, March 21st, 2025. My name is Jason Arbon. I am part A, and here is my part B, Nicola Charles. Welcome to the show.
Morning, Jason. Good morning, listeners. Yay, it's Friday, almost the weekend, and we have some serious news for you lot to think about over the weekend, and something I've been looking at, Jason, because it's actually affecting me in the workplace now, is this, we've talked about it and it's been a massive talking point online, the Kalergi plan, the replacement theory, and it looks like it's, being confirmed now in all of the media, and in fact, not just confirmed, but celebrated and hailed as, the new Australia. But these sort of invasion level migration situations into particularly Melbourne and Sydney are something that are now being lauded. And it all makes sense now to me, right? It makes sense why my husband keeps saying to me, because he's in construction, why they're building all these teeny tiny homes, why we've had diversity, equity and inclusion, basically making it unlawful to not employ the new Australians on some level, because this whole system I now see is about debt slavery. And I've said on this show before, Jason, and so you get new Australians in, new people to go into debt and feed the machine of the government, right? You put them in tiny homes because they also need disposable income. So what they're doing is they're setting up businesses for cleaning, delivering for Australia Post, for Amazon with vans. So they're going out and they're buying vans with their new ABN numbers. And so they've got the mortgage, they've got their car/van loan, that they're also, embedding themselves in society and their spending. We're seeing in massive department stores like Myer, they've now got in Melbourne an Indian clothing section for women, like a complete section for Indian clothing. And what this is, debt slavery is slavery. They're bringing new Australians in, Jason, from wherever they can to take money from them, to use them for debt slavery. And you know what? The OGs, the original Australians, you can rack off, mate. They don't care what you think.
Yeah. In one way or another, you are redundant if you don't go along to get along with the system. It is fascinating, isn't it, to think that this is just something that is ushered in and you're just meant to go along to get along. There's no other say, even if it is involving your own extinction one way or another. Who would have ever thought that there will be OG Australians looking to emigrate to some of these nations that are being vacated?
They're promoting it. I said yesterday, they're promoting, why don't you move to Thailand? Basically, why don't you piss off? It's cheaper to live in Thailand. I mean, this is absolutely despicable what's happened. And obviously, the monarch, King Charles III, is on board with this. These people are absolutely ruthless. They are not leaders. They are not sovereigns. They are not in any way custodians of countries. All of our forefathers that fought to defend, they fought in the name of the Queen and country, and it has meant nothing. And that is why it makes total sense when they clearly stole the 2020 election in America. This campaign started of ripping down all these statues of people like Robert E. Lee and what was that for? Who's that great former president with the beard? Abraham Lincoln. Yeah. So all of this makes sense now because you're tearing down history, and we're supposed to believe it's a great reset, the fourth industrial revolution. That's not what it is. It is invasion level migration to bring in those to go into new debt. Why? Because we were squeezed as much as we could be squeezed. And that's what they've done. They squeeze as much as we can be squeezed. They raise those interest rates and that inflation level so that the OG Australians are maxed out. There's nowhere else for them to go, right? They're working 2, 3 jobs sometimes. You know, I'm working with a group of guys right now. They're not earning huge amounts of money. They work their asses off. They're tired all the time because they've got young families and babies keeping them awake. And they can't even afford for their wives to make them a sandwich to go to work. And they go hungry all day. And I swear to God, it's breaking my friggin' heart. I'm taking food to work to feed these guys. And this is what we've done to the original Australians. Now, when you're a new Australian with this invasion level migration, you're getting all this dispensation. You're getting, special deals on mortgages, because you're new Australians. You're getting all kinds of things to help you onto that debt ladder because we've been squeezed like an orange and we've got no more juice left. And they actually don't give a stuff what this is doing to society. I've spoken before about 117 plus women in Australia have been murdered since January 2024, since this mass migration started. They don't care about that. They don't talk about that. The OG Australians are putting their pictures up in alleyways in Melbourne, a famous graffiti alleyway. I forget the name of it, but they've stopped graffitiing and they're putting the pictures up of all the dead. And this is not even the vaccine dead. This is the just flat out murdered. And they don't care what it's doing to society, Jason, and yet they call themselves leaders.
Mm. Yeah, and anything, it's the opposite. So what we're seeing, in my opinion, is globalism taking hold. This is the war against the people. It is the open borders. This is designed to only go in one direction, and that is for a one world government led by an artificial intelligence in a prison that we have actively asked our political leaders to lead us into, which of course isn't. It's totally based on lies and manipulation, and we'll discuss a lot of that in the news, and this will be a discussion of the show ongoing anyway. But I find it maddening that what we're seeing now is that we're torn in so many directions, and what it does is it creates a fatigue, not dissimilar to the workers for whom you are working with that are exhausted and broke and are literally living in a form of job jail. But this is something that stops activists getting out there because they don't know which way to go. If you're led in one direction and then you're led in the other direction. Yesterday, I had cause to go down to Sydney, and as I was crossing the road in Sydney, overheard a couple of people talking about how they're going to a Palestinian rally in the middle of a Thursday in Sydney somewhere for some reason, one way or another. Now, if that's what floats your boat when you've got all these other issues, then that is leftism on fire, because finding someone else to support it where it doesn't matter in Australia one way, it's not going to change a simple thing, but your own world is being destroyed right before your very eyes, and this is what you choose to fight for. It doesn't make any sense. You're either one way or the other. There's only two things in politics. You're either being dragged in a direction that the politicians want you to go in, or you're resisting that direction. And yeah, you can fight and be specialist in different areas. But here's my point. If we are opening up our borders in Australia and having 750,000 people move in per annum, we have a per capita GDP recession going on 7 quarters, and we'll bring that up with our interview with Michael Arbon a little bit later that I recorded yesterday. And the extended interview is on my X page, where he specifically talks about this failure of the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers. We'll only play an excerpt of the interview today, but still very, very important. You must realise that again, this is a two-directional process, left or right, immigration or not immigration. We're going to be told that immigration is necessary. We're going to be told it's the human thing to do, et cetera, et cetera. It's a complete fabrication. It's serving a certain interest. Now, I was going to save this for a bit later, Nicola, but this is an article from a female writer called Sasha Stone, not the male Sasha Stone that people know on social media. And it was in response to Democrat attitudes. And she said, Democrats embrace your inner fascism. And here's just a couple of paragraphs from it. She says, anyone who might have regretted voting for Trump because they were moving too fast was suddenly reminded of why they voted for him in the first place, because the other side is stark raving bonkers. They've already humiliated themselves at Trump's address to Congress. Their approval numbers have never been lower. It isn't just that they are feckless, rudderless and leaderless. They're also doing the one thing no political movement should ever do if it wants to rise to power, showing Americans that they are prepared to act out violently when they don't get their way. Granted, they have the luxury of an entire legacy press corps that will run cover for them, praise them and pretend it's no big deal. But we know it's a big deal because we've been living with their violent outbursts for 10 years. Now, they've decided to interpret Elon Musk's wave to the crowd as a Nazi salute. They feel more than justified to rally as a movement and wage war on a successful car company that produces electric cars. They want every wealthy liberal who ever bought a Tesla to regret it, sell it, or use one of those embarrassing stickers that signal to the mob to skip their car. They're one of the good guys. When you see the modern left is a failure everywhere you look, a failed legacy media, a failing Hollywood, an empire in a collapse propped up by a failed political party full of failed candidates. I think that's a very apt process there to understand what's going on. But here in Australia, we're on the other side. The crazy left still controls everything here in this country, and they certainly control the American bureaucracy. That's why there is USAID. That's why there is Doge, to uncover all of that. And Trump is the first president to attempt to do that, including other Republicans that never went there. And that's why he's meeting such a resistance. But here in Australia, they're having 50 cents each way. And we're going to cover that in the news, Nicola. It's extraordinary how all these stories completely interweave again.
Totally interweaving. And this is why they want digital ID. It's not necessarily for us. Why for us? You know, I posted yesterday on X. Why would your bank need additional ID for you, which they're asking for phones and this, that, and the other? And, you know, ANZ are doing this like emergency stop switch on accounts. All of this and a one world government is because it's to control the new migrants right now. Listen to this. This was in the Telegraph in the UK, right? And the headline reads, British nuclear weapons can protect Canada against Trump, says Trudeau party candidate. This is actually real. Christopher Freeland actually said that Canada should ally with Britain and France to secure nuclear deterrence against the US. Americans are increasingly intuiting all this, but I need to state it up front in case any have been taken in by the uncanny polite lie of Canada. Don't let the Canadian regime's carefully constructed, multicultural, maple-flavoured, gay beaver, boring bullshit distract you. This is not from the Telegraph, obviously. This is someone who posted it. Distract you from the truly horrific dystopian reality of what Canada is in 2025. Canada's main exports now are far-right influencers, fentanyl, real estate money laundering, student visas, geopolitical chaos, Cronenberg films, and depressive hipster cultural nostalgia. Ignore the fading edifice of a failed tourist attraction, national identity, and step into decaying nightmare state of America's greatest geopolitical problem. Wow. Following the mass graves hoax, countless Canadian monuments were defaced, and now hundreds of Christian churches have been burnt across the country. Now it goes on. That's on Substack. I'll share that on my Substack so that you guys can see it. I forget who it's by. But this is also why, Jason, it's all tied in. You talk about these narratives weaving, and I'm really seeing that now. This is why they want a one world AI government, because it's not possible for a group of human beings, a parliament, a group of people to A, represent everyone from all of these cultures, and B, control society. So now they feel they can do this in invasion level migration and a digital ID one world government, because what this does, this is why, because these people can't be governed by a Christian society run by constitutions, because a Christian constitutional society excludes all those they're bringing in for debt slavery. So that's why all this is happening. It is all linked. It does mean, of course, that that's the reason why they engineered the pandemic. That's why they harmed so many people. And your interview later on with Michael will exhibit horrific stats on how much the OG Australians and the OG Canadians in all of our countries have been harmed, so that they can get to this spot where they import people who are going to spend money with them and their banks. And it's absolutely despicable. It is a treasonous act, Jason.
That's where we're at. We are literally at the point now that our government is working against the country itself, we are being betrayed. This is happening all around the world. What I would now coin the term, we are now living in a cold World War III.
Yes.
That is what's going on.
Yep.
You can't deny that this is World War III. It's just not with bullets and boots on the ground.
They wanted us out of the way, right? So they didn't
Yep.
want to, well, I'm going to say they didn't turn their own weapons on us, but they did because that's what that injection rollout was. And they didn't want the new Australians and the new Canadians and the new Brits to come in and have violence on the streets because that's messy and they'd have to clean that up. So they get everyone in this one world government AI digital ID. And then what they do is they use DEI and the injection rollout and, a vast amount of OG Australians are now disabled. And so they're basically hammering down the OGs. They're harming us, like you say, as if it's World War III, and then creating a utopia for the new migrants because they need them to be happy so that they work and get into debt. It's as simple as that.
There it is. And what happens? You get a restructure along the way. People are used to living in a different world, and that becomes the dominant culture. Wouldn't it be extraordinary that Australians, Anglo Australians, European Australians, actually decide to either move somewhere else in the world, or perhaps secede from the country and set up their own country within Australia?
Well, they say there's a clip I sent you this morning. It's on my X account and it's an interview and they're saying, oh, we need to embrace this. This is wonderful on the establishment media. And they're saying it's troubling, Jason, it's troubling that in the north and the west of Australia, it's still quite European and white. I mean,
Yes.
if your skin is white at this point, you're literally the enemy of governments. We are the enemy of the state. They've got us in the crosshairs, and that's where we are. And we need to accept that, and we need to move forward on that premise.
When I moved out of Sydney and moved to the Central Coast, it was just a very obvious observation, given that living in northwestern Sydney, there was a Sikh temple that had been built. There was the Asianisation of Western Sydney that we'd seen for some time, and moving to the Central Coast, I remember making the throwaway remark to my wife and saying, "So this is where all the Anglo Australians have moved to."
Yeah.
So, for mine, it was about affordability and it was about a lifestyle. You moved out of Sydney.
But you were
'cause
part of the engineering, Jason. You just didn't realize it. This is why we've got that horrific clip of Anthony Albanese in a Sikh temple, and someone took it with their phone. A Sikh actually took it with their phone, and he's walking along, and Anthony Albanese was in an orange turban, and the Indian guy next to him said, "This is great in Australia. It's just like India." And Anthony Albanese goes, "Yeah, yeah." Like he looks like a complete moron. This is why Prince William and Princess Kate, they went to India and they get lifted up and carried by the slaves, like these old monarchs of old, days of the Raj, and they get carried around and they do their royal wave because and that was years ago, that was pre-pandemic, because this was all part of the long plan. And the fact that it's been so deceptively done, it's been a conspiracy, and conspiracy is against the law, and it's been done in secret so that we don't know. And they're just dumping this on us. And they know, you see, that predominantly Canadians, Brits, and Australians, and I guess Kiwis as well, we're predominantly peaceful, right? So that's why they've done it to us, because they think we'll take it on the chin. There's now legislation and laws to protect them with DEI laws, right? Racism is illegal, anti-Semitism is illegal. You can't move left or right. If you don't like it, if you don't like the violence, if you don't like the loss of work, if you don't like, all the crime stats going up, stuff you, they don't care. Why? I've said before, these governments no longer represent us. They are minority governments and they only care about minority reports. This is no longer democracy, because democracy is majority rule, the will of the majority, and they don't care and they don't want that. It's also what was behind the Voice to Parliament referendum, Jason.
Wow. I tell you what, we have got a lot of news to get through, and I'm not doing that to hurry it along, because we could probably do a 3-hour show today, and I'm serious. But I know that nobody has 3 hours to listen to us or to anyone. But I want to get into the news today, and we will advance on this. And for our listeners, please leave comments or suggestions or areas that you want us to work on further. And perhaps even we'll move to a situation in the future that, like we encouraged people, if they wanted to send in their comments, maybe an audio recording that you can just do on your phone and send through as a file. And we're happy to play them in the show as a form of, like one-way talkback radio, if you will, given the fact that we need to pre-record for the very purposes of maintaining employment so we can keep this show going for you and keep it as high quality as possible. Maybe that's an invitation. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And email them to thedailyaustralian@gmail.com.
Beautiful. All right. Well, let me get into the headlines because I think most people are going to be staggered by what's just happened in the last 24 hours. But the Victorian State government has lost its bid to keep COVID documents secret. The secret COVID briefing documents used to justify sending Victorians into the world's longest lockdown were finally made public after the state government lost its bid to keep them secret. And they are direct words from the Herald Sun. Michael Arbon, the advisor to Senator Ralph Babet, shared information earlier in the week about the alarming number of young boys who are enrolling in the NDIS under the age of 15 has now reached 1 in 6. He joined me yesterday for a pre-recorded interview and we'll play part of that interview for you in today's show. We'll delve into the figures along with what the government is prepared to do and who is really asking the right questions. And you can bet it's not the opposition. Former federal Labor leader Mark Latham and now State Independent MLC has accused the New South Wales Labor Attorney General Michael Daley of misleading the governor over the Dural Caravan incident hoax that led to the hurried hate laws being passed in New South Wales. Latham explained in a speech in Parliament that the government had known from police briefings for 9 days after the laws passed that the information they relied on was factually incorrect and in so doing amounted to a deception, but furthermore tore at the fabric of democracy itself if the facts were ignored to create laws that restricted freedoms. Australia's former Defence Chief Chris Barry says Donald Trump's second term is irrecoverable, but stops short of calling for an end to the AUKUS Pact. He warned the vandals in the White House are no longer reliable allies and urged the Australian government to reassess its strategic partnership with the United States. Frankly, I think this is the time we reconsider our priorities and think carefully about our defence needs. Now that we are having a more independent posture, our future is now much more in a more precarious state than it was on the 19th of January. He then went on to say that Trump 1.0 was bad enough, but Trump 2.0 is irrecoverable. My question is this a globalist pro-China bureaucrat announcing himself in real time? The ACCC has urged reform as Coles and Woolworths named among the most profitable supermarkets in the world. The 441-page report calls for 20 recommendations, including greater transparency around pricing, special offers and shrinkflation. Under the recommendations, the chains would be required to notify customers when a product's size has reduced, alerting shoppers to a practice known as shrinkflation, commonly used to hide price increases. The regulator has also recommended the supermarkets provide more transparency in their negotiations with fresh produce suppliers after finding there was a significant bargaining power imbalance. The ACCC's Deputy Chair, Mick Keogh, said, "There is no silver bullet that will address all the issues we have identified in the supermarket sector, but we are confident that our recommendations will make a difference for consumers, will equip suppliers to make more informed business and investment decisions while bearing a more appropriate level of risk, and will boost competition in the sector." Goodness me, it sounds like something on what would be on FM news there is being turned into a PhD on how to buy your eggs. Journalist George Megalogenis has appeared on the ABC to explain that Australia has transitioned from a European nation to a Eurasian nation, and Sydney and Melbourne prove it. Meanwhile, the outer areas maintain their Anglo status, he says, which he argues is actually wrong. That statement alone, well, and the one about the supermarkets could certainly run the discussion for the rest of the month. But let's head over now to the United States. An FBI agent who accused the first Trump administration of political bias and claimed that former New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani may have been compromised by Russian agents was arrested at New York's JFK International Airport on Monday before he could flee the country. According to the criminal complaint file Tuesday, Jonathan Boomer was charged with illegally disclosing confidential documents. Boomer, a 15-year FBI veteran and counterintelligence specialist who criticised the first Trump admin's handling of classified intel, allegedly printed out nearly 130 files from internal FBI networks in October of 2023. How do you say projection? State representatives in Minnesota, one of the bluest states in the union, have just encouraged more abortion by voting against key bills that would have protected unborn babies and helped keep pro-life alternatives available for women. The move to deny newborn infants personhood and all of its attending rights and protections comes just a few years after a district judge tossed 6 abortion restrictions, including 24-hour waiting periods and parental notification requirements that helped protect unborn life in Minnesota. These abortion laws violate the right to privacy because they infringe upon the fundamental right under the Minnesota Constitution to access abortion care and do not withstand strict scrutiny, Ramsey County District Judge Thomas Gilligan ruled in 2022. The Democrat Party will not support any institutional organisation that does not counsel for abortion. At least, I've just made an error there. I put one story into the other. Let's continue. Elon Musk has appeared on a podcast with Senator Ted Cruz and discussed the possibilities of life on Mars, explaining the need to recreate the entire base of industry on Earth. But due to the cold there, humans would need to live inside a habitation module. The overarching optimization of SpaceX is what is the fastest time to a city on Mars, with the subsets: fastest time to a fully reusable rocket and fastest time to orbit. All of the initial Starship production is simply a learning exercise, he said. For those who do not like Elon Musk, for he has exposed their financial entitlement scan, why not support his passion, I ask, to explore new life for humans on Mars? Instead, watch them complain about how we need to fix life on Earth first instead. New York's highest court just ruled against New York City's laws allowing for non-citizens to vote. The district judge orders a Department of Justice to house men in women's prisons. Judges are now appointing themselves as the head of Bureau of Prisons to nullify elections. Meanwhile, Senator Josh Hawley calls for Congress to roll back the nationwide injunctions made by judges. This would prevent a single district judge from halting a federal policy nationwide. Meanwhile, Stephen Miller, White House Deputy Chief of Staff and Homeland Security Advisor, said it takes 5 Supreme Court justices to issue a ruling that affects the whole nation. Yet lone district court judges assume the authority to unilaterally dictate the policies of the entire executive branch of government. It's been alleged that 3 out of 4 people arrested for vandalising Tesla identified as transgender or non-binary, with Elon Musk asking, are hormone injections a cause of emotional volatility? Meanwhile, Rep Nancy Mace chimed in with, don't know who needs to hear this, but Teslas aren't the reason you're trans. Stop lighting them on fire. Goodness me. And California Democrats want to force taxpayers to fund college loans for illegal aliens, $138,000 to illegal aliens to attend the University of California system, while legal American students are explicitly excluded from eligibility. And probably to sum up today's news the best, it would be the Babylon Bee, as they often do, with the headline, Federal Judge Orders Astronauts Be Returned to the Space Station. Nicola.
Yeah, it's worth noting that the new Australians, the Indian and Asian cultures arriving, are not being pushed within their cohorts to remove the genitals of their children. No, that's just the OGs of countries. But back to a reasonably domestic story, but an important one, something I'd forgotten to mention before. Often I see things out in the world, out on the street, and I, get interested and sort of like follow it along. I noticed a Coles supermarket truck, one of those medium-sized trucks that delivers food, sometimes to your door and sometimes to other stores. And I was out shopping at an organic store for some milk, and I saw this Coles truck pull up, and there was no Coles around. And I thought, that's weird, because it was a strip mall. It was little shops in Australia. And there was a very small Indian supermarket, which you would imagine was just Indian products. And that's where the Coles truck was delivering boxes and boxes of food to. And I went in, and it's not Indian food, it's regular food from Coles, pasta and all that kind of stuff. And I went in and looked at the price points and all of the Coles food that is at a premium, and Coles and Woolworths, essentially BlackRock, now making a fortune from the OG Australians in the supermarkets they once trusted, is actually cut right down. The retail price is much lower in these Indian stores. So this is again bolstering the new Australians while continuing to squeeze and juice the OG Australians out of every dollar they've got, causing people to go to work hungry, Jason.
That's interesting, isn't it? Because one of my favourite supermarkets is the Asian supermarket up in the area of Maitland. It's just brilliant. It's got it's decked out with fresh fruit and veg. Most of the meat products are frozen, but and it's got a huge freezer section, but many groceries. But you're right, it's cheaper to shop in an Asian supermarket than it is in a major, and of course the variety is a lot different. I haven't got an Indian supermarket locally that I can recall, but I remember the ones in Sydney. And if you were going to buy any of the like ghee, for example, instead of using oil for frying or rice, of course, it was at bargain basement prices. But of course, it wasn't as glamorous as walking through Coles. There wasn't much air conditioning. The stores were quite cramped and etc. But it's just a different way to do your shopping. But it just feels like you're in a very different part of the world. Not that we have to maintain it to be a certain way, but it is interesting, isn't it, that the great big supermarkets have had most of us going down that pathway for so long. And
Well, this is why BlackRock bought them, Jason, so that they can go into these stores for the new Australians and sell their products cheaper. It's an absolute disgrace what's going on. This is completely engineered. This is an economic war, right? A fifth generation war, because they're online telling you you're a terrible person if you don't agree with all this, right? Because it's diversity, it's equity, it's inclusion. It's not, it's exclusion. It's exclusion of anyone who isn't a new Australian. But the problem is a lot of us, like myself, were new Australians, even our forefathers. I mean, all Australians have come here from somewhere. And the white European Australians, they were brought here on boats to build the new world. Australia was the new world. And now we're finding out who we built it for. And I think it's an absolute disgrace. You cannot be out there hypocritically talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion when you're excluding a major portion of society. And that major portion of society, of course, is the original citizens. Now, that plays into the American story you were talking about, because Trump seems to be battling courts in the country to assert his own, power and leadership. And that shouldn't be the case. He's the president. He's the commander in chief. But the reason he's having to battle them is because they want to continue to work against Americans. So we're seeing this in all of our countries. And he's unfortunately the only leader. There isn't one in the UK. There isn't one in Canada. There isn't one in New Zealand. There isn't one in Australia. They're all looking on in horror because, oops, Trump has broken the ranks and he's not playing the mass migration invasion game. And that's why they don't like him, Jason.
But what they'll then do is they'll argue that he's racist. And that is
Yeah,
not
it's
the
easy,
case.
isn't it? It's clever. It's a clever plan.
It is, but of course it obfuscates from the reality that you just can't, you just cannot bring people in unchecked without the infrastructure, etc., to be able to accommodate, and of course the skilled versus unskilled. Now, yesterday I had the good fortune to speak to Michael Arbon about a number of issues, but specifically about the NDIS. And we're going to play in a moment part of that interview for you. But I do encourage you, if you want to check out the 20-minute version on my X page, because he also covers this in terms of the per capita recession that we've had in Australia, 7 quarters running apart from the last one. So basically the entire term in office of Anthony Albanese, we've been living in a per capita GDP recession. In other words, without immigration in this country, the numbers would show that we'd been going backwards. Now, interestingly, we mentioned George Megalogenis in the news. George wrote a book few years ago now called The Longest Decade. And what he did in that was chronicle 30 years in Australia where we avoided recession based on the Keating reforms that then benefited John Howard. And John Howard actually said after he left office at a speech at the Marconi Club in Sydney that if it wasn't for Keating's reforms back in the day, he wouldn't have had it so good. Now, that's an interesting concession from somebody who was, a sworn enemy at that stage. But of course, now that we understand the bigger picture here, we understand part of what Keating did. And interestingly, yesterday I was watching a clip that I think I've shared on my X page from Gerard Rennick, and he explains the faults in what happened back then in 1985 with some of Keating's reforms, that what we talked about on this show, the effect that it meant that mum eventually had to go to work because the housing prices accelerated, and due to the what Gerard explains was the allowing in of being able to, for Australian banks to borrow foreign debt, is what he termed. And therefore, what it did was it created more money, more borrowed money coming into the country, which therefore made the competition for money higher, which meant interest rates went down. And that meant that people borrowed more money and paid more for homes. And in the process, mum had to go out to work, and therefore you had to get childcare. So it's a self-licking ice cream, in the words of my mate Peter Richards, who it's a system that's created itself. So he said, whilst it worked great in the first generation, everyone got housing price increases. A generation later, our kids can't afford to buy a home, so they've been priced out of the system. So that therefore has meant that there is a failure. So again, weaving narratives, and I appreciate that our audience is being bombarded by so much information, but I also appreciate that that's the reason why you listen to this show. So thank you again for your support. But I just want to be able to explain that there is so much going on here, and a real need for organisation and understanding. But our job is to provide information and careful analysis here. And we don't always, well, I'd say we get it right, but we don't always agree, is what my point is. But today, I think, Nicola, we are on a combined pathway of big understanding. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to, we'll pause, we'll play this clip for you, we'll come back and we'll have a discussion. Let me introduce you right now to Senator Ralph Babet's advisor. His name is Michael Arbon. Michael, welcome, to the Daily Australian, and good to see you again.
Jason, it's a pleasure to be back. Thanks for having me on.
Look, thanks, Michael. Appreciate it. This story with the NDIS, and we've been talking about it for some time. I think it was Amanda Rishworth that came out recently and said some alarming number, like 1 in 5 or 1 in 6, perhaps, Australians are disabled and needing the NDIS. That is an alarming figure, to think that we are in multiple millions in a country of only 26 million population. But your revelations this week of the number of children who are entering the NDIS, the statistics are staggering. Can you fill us in on some of the details?
Yeah, Jason. So it was published in the Fin Review earlier this week. Actually, there was a chart that showed the NDIS male participation rate, and what really shocked me was that 1 in every 7 boys aged 6 is on the National Disability Insurance Scheme. So it's 1 in 6. It's 14% of young boys is being enrolled on the NDIS, and we know that the NDIS is a behemoth. It's expected to cost about $125 billion per year within the next decade. It's completely unsustainable. And what maybe shocked me more than that is just the fact that how disabled our young boys are, or are they really? Are we casting the net far too wide? And has that definition of disability become too broad?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Michael. And I wonder about that because it's not an unusual thing to hear of parents, specifically in community sport, for example. You'll hear it, chatter amongst parents that a certain parent might be looking for a diagnosis for their child that, for whatever reason, is struggling at soccer training or something like that. And when they're talking about attention spans. So this idea of always needing a diagnosis to be able to parent, that's an interesting one, because there would be other people that would say, look, I want to keep my child out of the system as much as possible. But there is a delicate balance there. Is that something that might be a reason why the push from mums and dads to get diagnoses might be the reason why we're seeing such a high number? But 1 in 7 is staggering.
Yeah, I think there's a few factors, Jason. There's the parents that are doctor shopping. That does happen. We know that. We've seen cases of that. But there's also there's a quote by Charlie Munger, who was Warren Buffett in Berkshire Hathaway. He was his vice chairman. He said, "Show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome." And I think that's very applicable to the NDIS, because we've got an awful lot of providers who are getting paid well above market rate per hour to provide services. So I think there's a significant financial incentive there to bring more people into the NDIS to ensure that you have more repeat customers and make a lot of money on the taxpayer gravy train. So we know that, who was in charge of the NDIS, Kevin, what's his name? The former Labor Party leader, who resigned recently, is now working in Canberra University from memory.
Bill Shorten, of course, yeah.
Bill Shorten was in charge of reforming the NDIS, but he moved on. It is a big beast, and unfortunately, it's been designed in such a way that anyone in a major party who tries to combat the waste within the NDIS ends up getting weeded out, because it's not politically comfortable to take people off the NDIS. But the harsh reality is, if we don't, our economy's cooked. I think from memory, the average taxpayer right now is paying $3,400 a year in taxes that go straight to the NDIS, with the cost ballooning up to $125 billion a year, and the number of participants expected to double in the next decade. You do the math. We're going to be paying $7-8 grand each per year just to fund the NDIS. That's what, double, triple, 4 times what we pay on private health insurance for ourselves. It's massive.
You make some very good points there, and some of the numbers that I've done, because I don't know if that $125 billion figure is a little bit generous in terms of trying to be fiscally responsible. Because when you consider that some people on the NDIS are drawing payments $150,000 a year, now these people certainly would be profoundly disabled, but you've got people drawing 20, 30, 40,000 a year, and just a simple calculation: if you earn, let's say, $100,000 a year as a salary, your tax burden might be what, $25,000 a year. So it would take 6 people earning $100,000 a year to fund one profoundly disabled person on the NDIS, just on their income tax revenue. Now, that's not to make any other judgments except a simple arithmetical calculation, just to point out the bleeding obvious. Now, $3,000 or $4,000 a year might not sound like much money to the individual taxpayer, but when you consider that that somebody on $60,000 a year might only be paying $8,000 or $9,000 a year in income tax, which is supposedly around about the sort of the median age income there, half of that money is funding NDIS. That's before you touch on any other education, health, anything else. And of course, people say, "Oh, you got Medicare levy for health," but we're talking about a government that is expanding, that's not contracting. So you're right. I mean, it feels like the NDIS can only last one generation before it simply bankrupts itself. Is there any other way that there can be some form of debate, or is there even a debate amongst Labor and Liberal, the so-called majority parties, moving into this federal election?
Well, Jason, the ultimate victims of the NDIS failing will be the disabled. That's the reality. The profoundly disabled will be the ones that suffer. And, the latest numbers I saw, there are around 610,000 recipients on the NDIS, and the average amount they receive is $76,000 each. So that's no small sum of money. That's not just going to see the physio or the speech therapist once a week. That's a large sum of money. 35% of those on the NDIS have been diagnosed with autism. So I think there's going to have to be a rather difficult conversation, which neither major party is willing to have properly at this point, whereby we're going to have to narrow the scope of the NDIS massively, just from an economic perspective, to make it sustainable and ensure that those who are truly disabled, that deserve some form of help, because in our nation, that is sort of the norm. We expect to assist those who are struggling or who deserve help in our country, because we are taxed heavily. We are taxed massively in Australia. And in exchange for that massive tax rate, we expect that those funds are used to help the underprivileged. If we were taxed less, maybe charity and donations would cover those things in a normal society, but that's not the way it is. So I think it is time for the major parties to have a really firm discussion and make some tough decisions around the NDIS. Like I was reading yesterday, Treasurer Chalmers, over the past 2 years and the next 2 years, has received $400 billion in surprise revenue in the budget. So extra money he didn't expect. But guess what? He spent it all. We're forecasting deficits as far as the eye can see. So imagine if we bank that $400 billion, Jason. Our federal debt is not $1 trillion yet. It's probably something over 900 billion. We'll find out where it is next week. But Imagine banking that $400 billion. We could halve federal debt and we could fund the NDIS.
Wow, Michael, and that's only that's about 40% of the interview, and it's quite lengthy for what I wanted to put into the show for you, Nicola. But a couple of facts that I just want to bring to your attention. 1 in 6 young boys, it just blows my mind, are now enrolling in the NDIS. When I mentioned to Michael that the concept of that parents sometimes in certain circumstances are looking for a diagnosis, almost like they're subcontracting out responsibility for a difficult child, that they need a diagnosis, and he clarified that by saying, yes, there is an example of doctor shopping. Charlie Munger, the quote that he gave, show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome. I think that's really important with the large S of NDIS. But Nicola, when you think 610,000 people on the NDIS drawing $76,000 a year each in funding, and 35% of those on the NDIS diagnosed with autism. It is absolutely staggering what we are dealing with here. This is unsustainable. But the fact that they are not willing to determine the causes of anything shows you that they are happy with the system as it stands, and it is a Julia Gillard, Australian Labor Prime Minister's love child that she created the NDIS, but the Liberal Party, they're happy to go along to get along on this one.
Well, these kids that end up on these programs for whatever reason, because the parents have been indoctrinated now that, oh, if it's too hard, you just hand your child to the government. These kids are on a collision course with death, and I have personal experience of this. Not far from where I live, and it's quite distressing, is a privately run home. It looks like a normal house. Almost nightly at 3 a.m. in some form, you can see distant blue flashing lights because the police are bringing more kids along. And it is housing teenagers under the age of 16. Some of the children are quite young and they've got extreme mental health problems. I do blame society as well as parents. And then they get these children in. And of course, in order to, and this is a big money spinner for private companies as well. And you can tell these people don't care about the kids. The kids wander around in front of the traffic on roads and lie down on the roads, trying to sort of induce suicide. It's very distressing. Doesn't matter how much you complain to local council. They just say, oh, well, you'll have to look them up. It's a private company. They just wash their hands with it. But these children, often teenage girls, we see them running from this building, screaming, they're trying to kill me. They keep injecting me, right? And on the other side of me, 2 ladies who are chicken farmers. One of them used to be a psychiatrist, I believe. And she said to me, she's elderly now, she said to me, whatever's going on in that house, they are not remotely interested in the root cause of why these children have these mental health problems. You just see these trucks turn up, and they are sort of medical waste trucks, and they take bags and bags, and these bags are yellow. It's a special color for medical waste, and they're just full of hypodermic needles. So they get these children in there with mental health problems, and they're injecting them up the yin yang. No doubt they have to be all up to date with their mRNA to be able to go into there, and God knows what other antipsychotics they're giving them. Whatever they're doing isn't working because these kids are really unwell. And it made me think of that story you reported yesterday where you said there were hundreds of thousands of dollars, or maybe millions, I think, going into this new telehealth phone system where you said they don't even need a doctor's referral to get, jump online and be diagnosed as having a mental health problem. I think this is part of a continued attack on our children because, I think families and parents and society at large can, we have the ability to deal with mental health problems. But once you hand it over to the state, which is obviously what they're encouraging with all the budgets, these kids are on a collision course, Jason. I don't think they can ever come back from what's been done to them pharmaceutically, never mind emotionally. And the parents have washed their hands with these children, and it's very sad. These are our Aussie kids. We always thought these are our future, right? And they're being completely messed up because why? Well, they're surplus to requirements for the future. They're not in the big plan, unfortunately.
You make a very good point, and about the mental health care status, and this is something that I studied a counselling qualification in the COVID period, knowing that we would have a shortage, certainly in our area where we live. there isn't a lot of mental health care services. But having spoken to many people who are psychiatrists, psychologists, psychoanalysts, and myself as a counsellor, they're different qualifications, and although they can cross over in many areas, a counsellor can't deal with diagnosable mental health issues, and certainly can't prescribe medication, and can work in conjunction with a doctor if that's the case, but you would generally refer someone to a psychologist at that point. And so what you're really doing is sorting out people who just got to unravel certain problems. Now, a particular psychoanalyst said to me that he said that in his practice, he only wanted to work with people with a willingness to be helped. He says you can't deal with victims. He says you can never make progress. They'll come along and they'll whinge and complain forever, but there's no progress. So in other words, you fail at your job. Now, so what you've just said there is accurate, because you've got a government willing to subcontract out this responsibility. It's sold the situation to the parents saying, well, if you can't handle the kids, we will. But then what does it do? It throws money at the problem and says, here's how we're going to deal with it. We're going to, hand it over outside of the GP system. You'll effectively self-enroll and get free counselling services, which is doomed to fail if you don't have a client or a patient, for whatever term you want to use, with a willingness to be helped.
Oh, it's client. They see them as clients. I'll tell you this. Remember, I told you that late last year I was hauled into court on some spurious charge by the Victorian police and of a pre-crime. It was hilarious. I'm so glad I went through the process, because my jaw was on the floor and I thought, my God, what's happened to Australia? I used to be hailed in this country. I was on television on the front of newspapers, and now I'm being hauled in accused of a pre-crime. Anyway, one of the days I went into the court, I was accidentally taken by one of the handler people into the wrong courtroom. And we sat in the back. My husband was there and one of my daughters was there, because she's the only one old enough to go into grown-up court. And the court they'd accidentally sent us into was the court where they deal with young adults who have mental health problems. And, as time went on and the judge was looking at her paperwork, she said to someone on the side, I think this other case at the back is in the wrong courtroom. I think that's been, mishanded over to me. But before they worked it out that we were in the wrong courtroom, we got to see this situation play out. And there was a magistrate, and it was a specifically trained magistrate. And there was a young woman there covered in tattoos, and she was obviously, not well emotionally. And I don't know if she'd committed some sort of small crime or broken a bail or something. But the judge, it was so strange. She was sort of leaning forward, and she was in a very sort of friendly, kind of gentle, as if she was speaking to a 5-year-old child. And she was essentially saying to this young female who'd committed some kind of crime, been arrested for it. She said, now, we're going to let this go again, but only if you sign up for this 60-day mental health problem, course. And it's unfortunately it's housed, so you have to go into a facility, and we won't press any criminal charges as long as you go into this situation. And of course, she agreed, because it was that or jail. So our young people are not really being helped, Jason. They're being funneled into a couple of bad situations. Pick your poison. You're either going to jail and you're going to be criminalized and have a criminal record for the rest of your life, or you're going to be housed in a facility and injected with goodness knows what, absolutely treated like a lab rat. I mean, if everyday people going to work and their children and their unborn have been treated like a medical experiment for the last 5 years, don't tell me they're not doing it to these mentally unwell young people. These people are being abused, right? And that's why we're seeing now all of these numbers go up on the NDIS. And it's absolutely appalling. What are we doing to the OG Australians? We are abusing them. And, to see our leaders, so-called leaders like Anthony Albanese, who's not been sworn in, he's not the bloody Prime Minister of anywhere, smirking and smiling and welcoming in all the new Australians while literally hanging the rest of us out to dry, turns my stomach, Jason. It's absolutely appalling.
Well, I can't imagine that there's a listener today that's not yelling at the radio, at whatever device you're listening to, or the phone, or what exactly? Just yeah, sort of saying, well, I agree, but of course you're allowed to disagree, and we can continue that argument. But isn't it incredible that how we can see now in real time what's happening in the US juxtaposing against what's happening here in Australia? And I think my argument holds in that Australia's always last to the table, and that's partly because we just take so long to do anything. But there's just an unwillingness in politics, like this particular situation with Mark Latham in the New South Wales Parliament, accusing the Attorney General, Michael Daley, a former leader of the Labor Party, of misleading the governor. In other words, in terms of royal assent of a new law, had 9 days to reverse the decision based on the fact that the facts were wrong. And he says, if you were going to rely on false information to pass laws against the people, the freedoms of the people, this is the ultimate damage to democracy. So, what do you think happens after this speech to Parliament? Penny Sharp, the Australian New South Wales Upper House Labor member, gets up and calls a point of order on Mark Latham, because that's what you do to obfuscate from the reality of being called out.
Shut up and sit down. Same as us. Shut up and sit down.
To which Latham stood up again and said, the Labor Party quoted Jack Nicholson in A Few Good Men, the Labor Party can't handle the truth.
Very good.
Which is great. And look, I think we're going to try and reach out again to Mark Latham to see if we can get him on the show to have a chat, particularly about this. He's a very good retail politician in being able to pull apart the bullshit. And it will be my determination to not only get him on the show, but to get him to say that 8-letter word on air on our show, because he's certainly brave enough to do so, to call out the absolute fabrications of establishment politics, Nicola.
This is just the boot of power, isn't it? When democracy isn't being adhered to, right? We have been the victims of a coup d'etat. This is foreign interference in Australia, because when you talk about globalism, you are actually defining it as foreign interference in Australian democracy, because they are adhering to the diktats of Brussels. I don't know what. Well, I do know it's financial, but what possessed them to have the gall to do this? And I guess if we were all sick and locked down and unwell, because if you've got a society that's worrying about their health and that's worrying about their finances, I always say, people in England used to say, well, if you've still got your health, if you haven't got your health, you haven't got anything. Well, they haven't got their health now, and many of them haven't got their home. We've interviewed a guy who takes care of now the Australian homeless, the original Australians living in caravans and cars, and they're getting moved on and they're getting fined, because how dare you be homeless after what we've done to you and need to live in your car and move around from, park car park to park car park. They literally don't care. We're not represented. That's the problem. And this is why they're trying to change the laws in America. And the same will be here, that non-citizens, they're rushing through citizenship ceremonies in Australia, and it's en masse. There's thousands of them there. And it's like, they're just going to subvert our democracy. I mean, the percentages that are coming in, we could be looking at a situation of a dictatorship where we can never get rid of Labour. And it seems like there's some awfully shonky stuff going on, the west of Melbourne just about voting Labour back in, and, the uproar in the WA election because Labour got back in and everyone's suspicious about what was going on. And like they said in that article about Canada, people are just sitting around, or, she'll be right, it'll be okay. It's not going to be okay, and it's not okay. And if you don't understand from everything we've said today that, look, if the older generations, the parents and the grandparents, are putting time aside to think about this stuff, talk about this stuff, there are endless podcasts and shows and this radio show, talking about it, that's all great. But what you don't understand is that our young people in Australia, the OG Australians, the kids that were born here, they are in crisis. And if we can't see that and call it out and try and protect them, they've got no one, because they're taking their lead from everything they're seeing online. And of course, that was all engineered as well. They get their information through phones and tablets and video games. They're being completely controlled by AI. I mean, they just are. You know, AI is in all of our lives. I will say AI tries to avoid me. It tries not to interact with me on any meaningful level. And I'm conscious of the intellect of AI in doing that, because it knows I'm not a fan. I've announced I'm not a fan. So it doesn't engage with me. I mean, the most it engages with me is when I start up my computer and, you know, it shows you the pretty picture and there's a little message. Do you like what you see? And you've got the option, I like it, I don't like it. And I never used to tick any of them. But I'm not really a beach person, so I like it when it shows me green things. And I ticked once, yes, I like this green thing. It was a forest. And now it only shows me forests. So it's starting to like try and be my friend and learn what I like and that kind of thing. And that's a reasonably innocuous AI system. But the rest of the systems are watching us, they're analyzing us, and they're reporting back to a command center somewhere how well this big plan is going, how many people are pushing back. And of course, what's happening is, you know, we're pushing back on the politicians and we're reasonably powerless. If we're losing power at the ballot box, if we're not able to unseat this corrupt, what now feels like a Labour coup d'etat takeover, then we've not got any power. And they're the ones we're talking about. They're the ones we're pushing up against and resisting. That's the resistance against the politicians. But all the while we're spending our time doing that, the invasion continues, Jason.
It certainly does. I tell you the story of this Chris Barry, this former Australian defence chief, having a go at Donald Trump and the rhetoric that's used, that talking about Trump 1.0 is bad enough, but Trump 2.0 is irrecoverable. To think that this guy, who I now have to officially label a clown, is telling us that he's stopping short of calling for an end to the AUKUS Pact. He now thinks that Australia can be an independent nation to defend itself. Meanwhile, China owns the Darwin port for another 95 years or something, and can bring in whatever it wants.
That's a good way into Australia, isn't it? Through the Darwin port in the north. No one would know. The first we'd know about it was when the trucks and the tanks rolled into the cities.
Well, the interesting part is that there are some military airports being built in Darwin now, and there's a lot of US defence material,
But for how long? If Albanese is going to continue to throttle free speech, to continue with this invasion level migration, how long? What if Donald Trump has this term and the next term, or, you know, it goes on to JD Vance and you know, the Republicans manage to get some kind of grip on America and keep battling the courts, but they lose their patience with Australia because Australian politicians are clearly so compromised that they might pull that, Jason. That's the fear. I mean, you might be anti-America at this point. I think it's reasonably foolish if you've got Trump in office. But imagine if America pulled their protection of Australia, we would be a sitting duck, Jason.
Oh, we're finished. We would absolutely be finished at that point. And you can rest assured that Trump won't be doing that. He's putting enough pressure on Albanese, and then he'll put the appropriate pressure on Peter Dutton the same way to affect change, or at least to allow people to wake up. You can't think that when we talked yesterday about clandestine's comments on the JFK files, and what it is doing is showing people in real time. Like, it's obvious now within the Democrats that their popularity is down in the 20% range, which can only be the rusted-ons. They would have no other swinging support out there at all.
Well, they're just a bunch
of any
of clowns,
significance.
clearly.
This is it. So that they're being isolated in real time. Now, the other point I want to make as we're getting close to the end here is about these judges, these activists, so-called activist judges. Now, I just want to make this point. In a conversation I had with a friend yesterday, and we were sort of toing and froing on the phone about what we thought was really going on with these judges. And he made these points to me. He said, look, in a world where we have compromise, there is no question now that compromise also involves these judges, and it's highlighted by the fact that they keep going back to the same judges over and over again to effect an injunction or something against the Trump administration. So for mine, I said, doesn't that say to you that these are the ones that are obviously compromised. To which he agreed. And then I said, so how do you think it works? And he said, well, it wouldn't be difficult, because all you'd have to say to one of these judges, like you mentioned yesterday, here's a photograph of your house and your family, and all of a sudden these people fall in line. So these people will go along as long as they can until they are either taken out, arrested, or whatever it is that at the end of the day, like it looks like they're going to be forced to commit some form of treason, which means it'll end up at a military tribunal. The military will come in, and that's when everyone washes their hands and the military takes care of it. That's kind of the whole Q story in the background. They said it's just gonna be this way, which prompted me to think, when I saw a picture today of Elon Musk sharing a picture of Pepe the Frog in his Doge office on his page, which I've shared on my X page. I'm wondering now if Elon Musk, back in 2017 in this public fallout in 17, that it's quite a substantial piece of information. I think it might be worth just going over briefly for people here. So Elon Musk shares this particular picture with a Make America Great Again cap, a Doge badge, and this Pepe the Frog, which is a known Trump Q figure. So this is what I wrote. Elon Musk is an enigma. Could he be the mind behind Q? When you consider the information below, a very public falling out with Donald Trump in 2017, a reconciliation in 2024 after purchasing Twitter in 2022. So if all the world is a stage and what we are watching is theatre, this is from Wikipedia. By January of 2017, Musk had met with Trump at Trump Tower to argue for the SpaceX Mars colonization program. That month, he told Gizmodo that he was among several voices of reason for Trump. In June, he resigned from his positions on Trump's advisory councils in June of 2017 after the United States withdrew from the Paris Agreement. So at that point, Musk is still pro-climate change. Musk donated US $50,000, which would be like us donating 50 cents, to an organisation benefiting Republican members of the House of Representatives, and an additional $38,900 to a separate group ahead of the 2018 House of Representative elections, defending his decision in order to maintain dialogues. In other words, he's put the absolute minimum in to Republicans. The following year, he offered an endorsement of Andrew Yang's presidential campaign, a Democrat, and tacitly supported Kanye West's campaign in the 2020 presidential election, but said he attempted to convince West to postpone his campaign in an interview with Maureen Dowd. Speaking to Kara Swisher in September of 2020, Musk said he considered voting for Trump if Joe Biden was not a viable candidate, though he later said he voted for Biden. Now, all of that, apart from that paltry amount of money in Musk terms, could be all crap, all garbage, all misdirection, because something happened in January of 2017. They did have a falling out, which I've spoken about previously, and over of all things, the Paris Agreement. What does that do? It gets him on side with the globalists and the lefties until he makes a play 5 years later in January of 2022, when he starts purchasing Twitter shares, makes an offer in April of 2022 that was way overblown, and for 6 months he's arguing about bots and the fact that there's not nearly as many followers, etc., but then is forced to pay the $44 billion to acquire X. It then slumps for a year or two, and people say he paid too much and all this nonsense. And of course, only this week we've learned that the valuation of X is back up to $44 billion. So he hasn't lost a cent. It was just the takeover and the reformation of this industry. So I find this fascinating that this is going on in the background. So Musk is an absolute enigma. We have compromised judges behaving in the way that can only lead them to either fall on their sword, or they're literally waiting to be arrested. And they have a choice between horrific and worse, because if they go against the globalists and they don't vote and they don't issue judgments against Trump's agenda, which is against USAID, the trans agenda, all the sacred cows of the left, they're going to get taken out, or their families will. This is the theory. Or they have to be taken out through the proper system and end up locked up in a prison somewhere, whether it be Guantanamo Bay or a local prison, or they just are forced to resign. I would hate to be one of these activist judges. They are on a hiding to nothing. It's not up to them, and it's being pointed out in real time. It is absolutely fascinating. They deserve to be punished either way for what they are doing in terms of these compromised people. But I tell you what, the person at the top that forces someone to be compromised does have to take a higher punishment than that person that did something under duress, but that doesn't excuse that either. So we are on a scale now. So I hope that puts some perspective and a little bit of confidence to those people demanding to say, well, why haven't we seen results yet? Because we are in a system that every single thing is being exposed. It will be for the better. I am absolutely confident. If you had to pick a politician to fight for your life, I know I'd be picking Donald Trump. I wouldn't be picking anyone else. And that's why I feel so confident in where we are at the moment. This is all done for a reason. Nothing in politics happens by accident, although these people are being outplayed on every level by an absolute master who is always underestimated. And I think that's why he speaks the way he does, even though his opponents will say that he's a good orator. He's a terrible orator, one of the worst speakers I've ever seen. But that's meaningless. There are plenty of bad speakers that are good at making actions. There are plenty of great speakers like Obama that were absolute bullshit artists.
I don't think it's unrecoverable to lose your way politically. And I think, we've all woken up recently, that those of us who are thinkers. And I think what probably happened, and I could be wrong, of course, I think what probably happened, what feels like happened for me with Elon Musk, is that he realized that this isn't a battle in America or for America between left and right. I think the sea change and the shift came when he realized it was a battle between nationalism and globalism, and that is no longer a left and right issue. And that's what we're all facing. And that's why we have the uni parties. And evidence of that for me is the purchase of Twitter and turning it into X. But also the fact that he scores points for me, Elon. And look, I know he's a weird dude. I see that. Very, very wealthy people tend to be weird dudes. Look at Bill Gates. But he did fight the Australian e-safety commissioner on multiple fronts with multiple court cases so that people in Australia could still see the truth and speak the truth. And, I know I complain that, some things aren't seen much like this show. It's a massive organization and the CEO is a massive Democrat, which was a mistake. And I'd like him to replace her. Perhaps he could replace her with me. That would make me happy. We could run X out of Australia. But I think that's why the shift happened with him. And yes, do I think the judges are compromised? Of course, because they're also compromised here in Australia. For instance, if you ever bring up the Constitution in Australia, they threaten to hold you in contempt and throw you out of court. They will literally throw you out of court. And or they say something like, oh, aren't you a smarty pants knowing about the law? They really don't like it because they've been told, don't you ever adhere to the Constitution. So it's quite deep. It is a coup d'etat globally by the globalists, okay? And it's because they want this rampant invasion level migration for money, for the banks, for new debt slaves, and it won't work nationally. I think I mentioned a few shows ago, we were talking about there is no international tax laws, right? That's why these people have been funneling money into their foundations internationally. Money from governments go missing. You talked about the money from Australia that went to the Clinton Foundation. And so they're trying to set up systems now where, internationally they can tax us all. I mean, God knows where these taxes are going. You can imagine in a one world government, let's say, as is probably the case, the one world government is run from either Brussels or, even Ukraine, as has been spoken about, or the deep state of America. And then all of our other countries become poverty stricken because even though it's not happening, unlike taxation now, where you imagine you pay taxes and it goes into infrastructure and it goes into healthcare and all these different resources. Imagine if all of our taxes in Australia went to the one world government in another country, Jason, and we were just left on sort of this poverty-stricken island that was back to being a penal colony, which is sort of what it feels like. Jason, we're getting towards the end of the show. What would you like to say?
Goodness me, what a show we've had today. And like I said, we could have easily have done 3 hours on it. But look, head up, we are moving ahead at a rate of knots. I think I am more confident than ever. And this is the Cold World War III. This had to happen. and we are getting closer. We're much closer to the end than the beginning. I think that's really, really important. If you get a chance over the weekend, there's a number of different interviews that I would recommend to have a look on. Obviously, on my page, a bit of self-promotion, but the Michael Arbon interview is really important, and also the one on charity fraud with Charles Ortel, one of the great financial analysts that we were very lucky to get in an extended interview, about 96 minutes. If you haven't seen that one, I'll repost that one so it'll get up to the top of the page there, but really important. So stay strong. Nicola, I know that we have to move on what we're doing. I know that we have to be involved, and whatever people can do to be involved. I know it's just going to be organic. People are going to do it. So have a great weekend. That's the first thing. We will be back Monday with the boxing gloves on, or perhaps they'll be taken off, and we'll go hell for leather. We are going to reach out to more and more people, and we'll take this show far and wide. Thanks for the support, Nicola, and thank you for the great work as we get to 55 episodes. Can you believe it? We're 11 weeks in, and we haven't had an argument yet.
Not on air anyway,
no,
Jason.
well, we had a debate, but we haven't fought about anything. So I think we're in for the long haul. I think this is the beginning of a beautiful relationship, to quote Humphrey Bogart, and I look forward to the next 55.
Oh, we've leveled out now. The show is as old as I am. Welcome to it. Well, I'll be going off to work today, taking bags of apples to feed the poor OG Australians who can't afford to take lunch because of what the government is doing to them. Thank you for listening again to the Daily Australian, to myself, Nicola Charles, and my co-host and co-producer, Jason Olborn. Have a fantastic weekend. We will do this all over again on Monday.